Hi, welcome everybody. I am Claudia Silk, Adult Services Librarian at the Fairfield Public Library. The library is honored to co-host the last session of the Fairfield League of Women Voters Spotlight on Redistricting. Tonight's session is What to Do Now, Calls to Action. And now I will turn it over to Bryce Perry, the co-president of the Fairfield League of Women Voters. Thanks, Bryce.
Thank you, Claudia. And thank you to the Fairfield Public Library for their collaboration with the League of Women Voters in 2 sessions of our series, Spotlight on Redistricting and Your Vote. In the previous 3 sessions, we gathered authors, advocates, professors, and other experts to educate us on how critical the redistricting process is to democracy. They discussed what it is, how it's done, why it's important, and how it is communicated to the public, or not. Back with us tonight as panelists are Joan Twiggs, David Daly, and Mark Posniaskis. Tonight's program has 3 segments, opening with our guest speaker, Representative Jim Himes. Next, members of our panel will each offer a call to action before we open up to the moderated panel discussion. And we'll close with a few words from our partners. Now I'm very pleased to welcome Representative Jim Himes to our program. Representative Himes is serving his 7th term representing Connecticut's 4th Congressional District. Along with his many other responsibilities, he is chair of the Select Committee on Economic Disparity and Fairness and Growth and the National Security, Internal Development, and Monetary Policy Subcommittee. And that's a mouthful. Representative Himes is Fairfield's only national legislator who is elected using the maps that we're all talking about. He's uniquely qualified to share a broader national perspective on redistricting, as well as address specifics to Connecticut and Fairfield. Representative Himes, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is all yours.
Well, Bryce, thank you. A big thank you to you, to the League of Women Voters, and to the Fairfield Library for having this discussion, which I think is really essential. And I was asked to speak for about 11 minutes. I am going to probably spend most of my time talking about national issues, because I think having been very up close and personal with January 6th, I was in the chamber. I was one of the last out of the chamber, along with Rosa DeLauro. As you might imagine, I've been thinking a lot about what we do to buttress the core of our democracy, which is the concept that we determine our leaders via the votes of the people, and that we do our best to make sure that the process that results in leaders being elected is fair. And so, I mean, let me start with Connecticut. And the reason I say I'm going to spend more time on the national issue is not necessarily because of what I just said with respect to what I think is a democracy in some jeopardy, but because for the last 20 years or so, Connecticut hasn't been terribly interesting from a redistricting standpoint. We've just finished the process just last week. The Supreme Court approved new congressional lines. That comes off a couple of months after the legislature approved state Senate and state Assembly lines. That approval should make you nervous, and I'll come back to why I say that. The congressional lines were ultimately not subject to the agreement that the commission that under our Constitution draws the lines. Ultimately, there was an agreement, and as a consequence, the Supreme Court stepped in to appoint a special master. The special master made a recommendation subsequent to a hearing, and the Supreme Court just approved those congressional lines. The reason I say it's not very interesting is because we're a small state with now 5 congressional districts. There was a little madness 20 years ago when Connecticut was required to go down from 6 congressional districts to 5 congressional districts. But really, it's been pretty dull since then. And by dull, I mean we didn't really exemplify the kinds of battles royal that are happening in places like Texas and Illinois and Maryland, New York. that really have massive implications for control of the House of Representatives. And I'll come back to that. But just to finish up on Connecticut, you've got a geographically small state, roughly 3.5 million people, divides fairly evenly amongst 5 districts. The number is roughly 750,000 constituents each. And because of the last 20 years of partisan evolution, Connecticut is not really anymore a swing state. I say that with no pride when I'm doing League of Women Voters things. You all know I'm a Democrat, but I do my best to sort of pitch it down the middle. I say that just as a matter of observation. And because it's not a swing state, it would be actually quite challenging to draw a congressional district that would be a Republican congressional district. I mean, to do so, you'd really have to have a remarkably gerrymandered. I'm not even sure it's possible for a state that voted as democratically as it has, certainly in the last couple of presidential elections, to do that. So my point in saying that is just to say that, Connecticut hasn't been all that interesting. What actually happened in the congressional lines, and I'm going to leave the sort of state Senate and state assembly lines to the side for the moment, because I understand them a lot less. It's actually really important what happens there as well. And a lot of what I will say about gerrymandering and how those lines are drawn has real implications on the state house. It's just a process with which I'm a little less familiar. What actually happened with the congressional lines is that the southwestern corner that I represent of the state, basically Fairfield County, grew pretty substantially in population. So I had a surplus of roughly 20,000 voters identified by the 2020 census. And as I think everybody knows, the reapportionment is conducted by law every 10 years using the decennial census as its source of data. So Southwestern Connecticut, my district, basically has a surplus 20,000. Joe Courtney's district, which is basically the eastern half of Connecticut, because it's relatively speaking, lost population, needs to get 20,000-ish more voters. The challenge there is that our districts are not contiguous, so they need to move through Rosa DeLauro's district, which is basically New Haven and North, and that basically happened. It really did not alter the partisan performance of any of the districts all that much. So for all of those reasons, and because of that history, I tell you that Connecticut is, from a control of the federal government standpoint, not terribly interesting. Now, where it does get terribly interesting, and I want to put this into context for you, harking back to my opening comment about January 6th. I have a series of concentric circles that are sort of the core of my worry. And those circles, by the way, represent how threatening a particular thing is to the stability of our democracy, of our representative democracy. And by the way, it doesn't represent what's important or good or bad, but at the very core of that circle, what worries me most now is actually not redistricting and actually not voter suppression. Now, mind you, those two things are very serious issues with all sorts of skullduggery possible. But as I repeatedly tell somebody as an alumni of January 6th, January 6th was not going to be how our democracy ended. The thousands of people who broke into the Capitol, there was, I think, no real outcome where we find ourselves losing our democracy on January 6th. What worries me much more in the very core of my circle, and I'll move quickly over this because this is really about redistricting, is what I call voter negation efforts, which are underway in some places. So we all know the name Brad Raffensperger, who stood up as Georgia's Secretary of State, and when the ex-president asked him to, quote, find 11,808 votes or whatever the number was, he just said no. Well, around the country, we are seeing efforts to remove that decision-making process from people like Brad Raffensperger. Sometimes those are election officials who are elected, sometimes they're civil servants, but we're seeing a shift, primarily in red states, to move that authority in one way or another away from people like Brad Raffensperger into partisan state legislatures. It is way beyond the scope of this conversation for me to get into how much that worries me and why, but let me just tell you that that's at the center of the circle. On the outer ring of the circle are the voter suppression efforts which are underway. Now, let's be fair here. There's a lot of fuzzy thinking about voter suppression. My party raises all kinds of hell about Georgia because they're reducing early voting. They call it voter suppression. When Georgia's done, they will have a more amenable early voting system than the state of Connecticut or the state of New York do. And I just highlight that example because I say it's when I use a phrase like voter suppression, I want to make sure that that's a loaded phrase and that people understand that there are legitimate conversations about the process by which people vote. But I think it's also fair to say that there is a lot of skullduggery underway in certain places around things like voter identification, very specific voter identification, that is concerning. Now, to really the subject of this conversation, right between those two circles, I've got what I sort of call rigging the game. And redistricting and gerrymandering falls into that. And the reason I put it between those two things is that partisan gerrymandering won't end our democracy in the way potentially having partisan decision makers opine on slates of electors might. But it contributes to an erosion of people's faith that they're being represented. And what I mean by that, and it will, I'm sure, come up this evening, gerrymandering is sometimes characterized as elected officials choosing their voters rather than voters choosing their elected officials. And I think most people listening tonight will understand how that happens and why it happens. It happens because until recently, most congressional lines were drawn by partisan bodies, usually the state legislature. And if you think about it, it's the ultimate conflict of interest because you can, if I'm a Republican state senator, I can talk to a Democratic state senator and say, hey, I'm going to give you my Democratic voters and you give me your Republican voters. And the net effect of that is that both of us become safer in our districts. That happens also at the congressional level. And so the conflict of interest is clear. And the result of that is that depending on who you talk to and how they define it, 435 seats in the United States House of Representatives, the pundits will tell you that there's something between 30 and 60 of those seats that are truly competitive. And that's a real problem. It's a real problem because the seats that are not competitive, the other, let's call it 400 seats, November really doesn't matter that much. What really matters is who wins a primary. So in a deep blue or deep red seat where the other party doesn't really have a chance in November, the election is effectively determined in the primary election. And the problem with that, and I'm here to tell you this as somebody who sort of counts himself as a centrist in what used to be a Republican district, but is now a Democratic district, at least in performance. The problem with that is that when somebody like my attention shifts from November to the primary, we're communicating and addressing a much smaller and very different group of people, and that is our primary electorate. And there is just a radical difference between the primary electorate in the two parties and the general electorate in November. So if you've got 400 seats that are effectively being chosen by the primary electorates, and let's remember, primary electorates tend to be more activist. They tend to, I hate to use the word extreme because that has negative connotations, but they tend to be out there on the spectrum, the political spectrum. What happens is you see otherwise pragmatic, more centrist, more moderate, I understand these terms are all loaded, elected officials playing to those more activist elements. And, you know, all of us have seen it. You know, Mitt Romney, who was a very moderate Republican governor of Massachusetts, when he runs for president and needs to win a Republican presidential primary, he becomes, in his own words, a severe conservative and changes his tune on things like women's reproductive rights, et cetera. To be fair, you know, Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, spent ages promoting a Pacific trade deal. And when she was running in a Democratic primary, completely abandoned and in fact attacked the work that she herself had done as Secretary of State. So you see what happens there. And the reason I locate that in that sort of center ring of concentric circles is because it results in a House of Representatives that is far more, again, I understand this term has negative connotations, but radical, if you will, than the general electorate, because most people there have won by appealing to their primary electorate. And consequently, you see two things. You see an inability to compromise. The old days of, you know, a speaker ever considering losing their right or left extreme and making up that vote in the other party are long gone, because that's political extinction. We saw this with Speaker John Boehner when John Boehner opened a dialogue about immigration. His number was largely up when he decided to do that. Eric Cantor, similar story. And so you see the point there. Now, what can we do about this? the good news is lots of states have done something that is pretty effective at addressing the worst partisan gerrymandering, and that is the implementation of nonpartisan or bipartisan citizens commissions of one variety or another, that basically take the line drawing out of the partisan legislature and have the commission do it without that conflict of interest. The largest state to have done that, obviously, is California. Lots of other states have done it. And as a result, those states that have done it are producing more moderate representatives than those that haven't. The real rogues gallery of those that haven't are probably Texas, which is wildly gerrymandered. The Democrats largely out of existence in Texas from a House of Representatives standpoint. Remember, Joe Biden lost Texas by about 6 or 7 points, but when all is said and done, Texas is going to send roughly 2/3 to 3/4 of its congressional representation as Republicans. New York is on the other side of the aisle. New York has really gone wild in gerrymandering to a point where there may be 1 or 2, maybe 3 Republican representatives in a state that, again, was pretty blue, but whose congressional delegation will not in any way represent the partisan breakdown of the state. So commissions, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act had that in it. I was very, very supportive of it. I would really like to see that happen in Connecticut. I would like to see it happen all over the country. I was willing to say that at the federal level, we should impose it. Now, last thing I want to say, because it became so much the rallying cry for either side during the consideration of HR 1 and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, the Constitution is very clear in Article 1, Section 4, in giving the administration of elections, including of federal elections, to, as the article reads, or as the section reads, that those things shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature, comma. Now, here's where my Republican friends stop speaking, but after that comma, it says, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations. So what you see in the Constitution is both and. State legislatures and the Congress being able to prescribe the mechanisms by which federal officials are elected. So there's lots of other things that we need to talk about to try to what I would call depower the extremes in the House of Representatives. Right now, we have very, very powerful extremes in the House of Representatives for the structural reasons that I've just pointed out. There's lots of other things we could do. We could do ranked choice voting. You can do open primaries. They're beyond the scope of this conversation, and I'm sort of getting to the end of my time here, so I'm going to wrap this up. But probably one of the best things we could do to create a situation where the House of Representatives was more reflective of the way most Americans think about policy would be to yank this redistricting process out of the conflict of interest partisan environment in which it is now determined and turn it over to nonpartisan commissions that would try to draw districts that would be about more closely representing a state's partisan breakdown rather than seeking partisan advantage. And with that, I'll stop and say thank you again to the League and to all of you for paying attention today.
Thank you very much. And we do have just a little bit of time. Do you think, so in the Constitution, it says that we can make a national change to how redistricting is done. We've got that ability. Do you see that in this climate or maybe any other climate actually ever coming to fruition, happening, that there is agreement to do that?
Well, very interesting question, Bryce. And the quick answer to that is that in almost every state in which in almost every state in which a nonpartisan commission has been mandated, it has been mandated not by a vote of the legislature, but by some form of plebiscite or referendum. And so that sort of hints to you. And by the way, as a Democrat, I feel the tension. You know, I mean, frankly, it appalls me what New York and Maryland have done. But if you gave me a button that I could push to reverse that, I would only push that button if we didn't unilaterally disarm. If Texas and North Carolina would agree to reverse what they've done. So you see the conflict. We need to be since we won't unilaterally disarm, I think the route here is most likely going to be state by state imposing these commissions.
I see. Well, thank you very much. That was very interesting, and there's tons to talk about. And I'm pleased to introduce our panel members who will each have a few minutes to address redistricting before we open up for discussion. Joan, I'm going to start with you, just introducing. Joan Twigg serves as Connecticut champion for the People-Powered Fair Maps campaign, an initiative of the League of Women Voters of the United States on creating fair political maps nationwide. Joan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you,
Please
Bryce.
begin.
Thank you so much. So as Bryce just said, People-Powered Fair Maps is a nationwide initiative sponsored by the National League of Women Voters. Its core idea is to activate concerned citizens around the country to become engaged in and promote fair redistricting and fair maps. The League comes to redistricting from our positions both on redistricting per se, and in that the League does have a position favoring independent, non-political commissions, and our central mission of defending democracy and empowering voters. Redistricting is central to a healthy democracy and its core principles and needs, as Congressman Himes has just said. And at first, of course, the key principle is voters should choose their representatives rather than representatives choosing their voters. District maps should not discourage voting by encoding winners and losers in districts. District maps should not stack the deck. And government processes should be transparent and seek public engagement. Redistricting in Connecticut has been and continues to be completed behind closed doors. In this redistricting cycle, the League of Women Voters of Connecticut, and of course our Fairfield League in particular, engaged in education and developed messaging calling for greater public engagement and greater transparency. We were successful in getting that messaging out through various forms of media, print, radio, and television. However, the redistricting process was, as in the past, completed by a narrow circle of legislators. Not only was the public largely excluded, but so were most legislators. We are now calling on the General Assembly to pass a bill that would create a task force to study alternative methods and approaches to redistricting. And this is our call to action. And I'm just going to share my screen to bring that up so that you can see the language that we are proposing. So I hope everyone can see this. And this language is simply modeled on the ranked choice voting task force study that has been proposed also in the General Assembly. And you can see that, again, we're calling for greater citizen engagement and transparency, and that such a study should include and not be limited to looking at the development of an independent redistricting commission, establishing a parallel citizens advisory commission modeled on the New Mexico approach. And that's something that I learned about in the People-Powered Fair Maps program. New Mexico, in fact, had this parallel process that allowed them to assess a set of maps that were based on principles against what the legislature came up with. And importantly, this Citizens Commission needs to be supported by state appropriations. And then a third option is establishing transparency and accountability standards to wrap around the existing bipartisan process that is encoded in our Connecticut Constitution. And the language goes on to say that accountability standards to be considered are about these methods for public engagement, producing draft or concept maps. We encouraged the legislature this year, the redistricting committee and commission, to show us draft maps. And as Speaker Ritter said, well, we didn't really produce that. So this would be, let's delineate that process and have points at which the public is brought in specifically. Also to identify the incumbent residents in draft and approved maps, and to produce analytic reports that describe the districts. And then finally, to engage an independent expert to assess and report about the maps along dimensions such as preservation of communities of interest and partisan fairness. So that is our call to action. And the way that you can take action is to contact the chairs of the Government and Elections Committee. And there's the information for Senator Flexer and Representative Fox. So that's it, Bryce.
Thank you very much, Joan. And for all your work that you've done with the fair maps. I mean, it's exceptional. I do appreciate that. We have David Daly up next. And David Daly is a senior fellow for Fair Vote and the author of I never know how to do this, the true story behind the secret plan to steal Americans' democracy, and Unrigged, how Americans are battling back to save democracy. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I want to thank the League, the Congressman, distinguished panelists, all of you for joining us. These are extraordinarily consequential days for the future of our democracy, and much is uncertain. Partisan gerrymander, by all accounts, has never been worse. Indeed, we may come out of this cycle with fewer than 35 competitive seats of the 435 in the entire nation. Redistricting alone, map makers could determine partisan control of the people's house. After a decade in which partisan gerrymandering has rewired our democracy, contributed to the extremism that plagues our politics, pushed policy to the edge, but also undermined the people's will in the US House and state legislatures, often under control of the party that won fewer votes in the previous election. This is a dangerous moment. Connecticut's process, while it required the courts and the services of a special master once again, was not the partisan power play we saw from Democrats in New York, Maryland, Illinois, New Mexico, or from Republicans in Texas, North Carolina, Florida, Ohio, Georgia, Tennessee. You've emerged with a map with only minimal changes, 3 districts that are fairly solid blue, 2 districts that look competitive, at least on paper, though they changed only in small ways, and they have not been particularly competitive electorally for some time. So while on one hand, Connecticut looks like a reasonable outlier in a nation where redistricting has become an existential partisan bloodbath, a reasonably bipartisan process, if behind closed doors, a steady habits map, I would suggest Connecticut is actually a perfect example of the root cause of this dysfunction, which are single-member winner-takes-all districts that in a state like Connecticut, usually about 59-41 Democrat, Republican in statewide congressional vote, hands all of the seats to one side and none to the other. Republicans have won a steady 40% of the congressional vote in the state every year. They haven't won a seat in Congress since 2006. I'd suggest that's unlikely to change on these maps anytime soon. Those 40% of voters, however, deserve representation in the people's house. You've asked for one thing that I might like people to focus on over the next 10 years. It's that. I think we need to rethink the very notion of representation itself if we want to fix a house that has turned toxic. Certainly on January 6th, as the congressman talked about, I think you had 2 insurrections that day. You had what happened during the effort to block the counting of the electoral votes. But then you had a majority of the Republican caucus that walked back into that Congress over the glass, past the blood, and voted not to accept certified results from Arizona and Pennsylvania. And that happens because of the way that those lawmakers are incentivized and who they are incentivized to respond to. It's the base. The time has come to consider a transformative idea that reflects the American electorate's desire for fairness, for moderation, that encourages the reemergence of bridge builders and candidates with an eye towards consensus, for compromise. It involves changing the way we elect members of the House. The Fair Representation Act, which has been introduced by Congressman Don Beyer of Virginia, Jamie Raskin of Maryland, Ro Khanna of California, Jim McGovern of Massachusetts, is what I would argue for. It would make 3 fundamental changes in how voters elect their representatives to the US House. First, it would change congressional districts from single-member seats into multi-member districts as used in many states for their legislative elections. Think of it as a hybrid of what we have today in Senate seats, in which two people jointly represent a larger area. States like Connecticut with 5 or fewer House members would elect all their representatives at large. Any state with 6 or more representatives would use multi-member districts. 2, you'd have independent commissions that would draw those lines. And 3rd, you would elect candidates with ranked choice voting. You would allow voters to rank candidates in order of preference rather than simply voting for their top choice. You've got some version of this system already used in many municipalities. 6 states around the country have already adopted some kind of ranked choice voting. The problem we have with redistricting is in many ways a problem of districting itself. Whenever you have single member districts, you're going to have a bloodbath over where those lines go because the lines determine winners and losers. Let's make those lines less important. Let's make every district a swing district. Let's make every district a possible a home for Democrats, Republicans, independents, more opportunities for women and candidates of color. You can take a state like Connecticut, you can take Massachusetts, which is home to 9 congressional seats, all held by Democrats. You've got about a quarter of the states Republican. You've got a very popular Republican governor here, but you have not elected a Republican in Congress in Massachusetts since '94. That's longer even than the state of Connecticut. If you were to divide Massachusetts into equal thirds, apply ranked choice voting, elect 3 members from each district, a few things happen. For one, no district is gerrymandered. Each district represents a larger and more diverse array of voters. You attract more candidates and you entice those candidates to speak to everyone. If you were to do the same thing in Connecticut with 1 district of 5, I think you would likely see Democrats, Republicans, independents, real races every time. States like Oklahoma, for example, might be the opposite. Kansas, Tennessee, Arkansas, other states that have 4, 5, 6 members, where there are plenty of Democrats, but it's extraordinarily difficult to elect them because of the way that those states have been drawn. Sometimes the problem in those states is gerrymandering, but oftentimes it's simply geography. If you think about it, Washington in the grasp of bitter polarization, 4 of the 5 most popular governors in America have been Republicans from blue states in the Northeast, and Larry Hogan and Charlie Baker, Phil Scott, Chris Sununu. There's a similar pattern across the South and the Midwest. The most popular statewide politician in Kentucky isn't Mitch McConnell or Rand Paul. It's the state's Democratic governor, Andy Beshear. We've got 2 other Democratic governors of traditional red states, John Bel Edwards in Louisiana, Laura Kelly in Kansas, have maintained approval ratings in the high 50s. Higher ratings oftentimes in those states than even Donald Trump. But those 4 blue states send 20 members to the US House. Exactly 1 of them is a Republican. And those red states I just mentioned are 14 House seats, only 2 are held by Democrats. And both of those seats could turn red via redistricting this year. By next fall, those states that can elect successful governors of the minority party might not have a single House member representing the other side. No representation in the House at all for voters of the minority party, no liberal Republicans from New England who might serve as bridge builders, no Democrats from the Plains or the Bayou. It's not that those voters have gone extinct or that voters have moved past those philosophies. They've won statewide. They simply can't win election to the US House. Beyond the question of partisan fairness and the millions of unrepresented voters, I would say that we ought to consider what the lack of proportionality in our politics does to push us to extremes. You have nationalized elections and winner-take-all districts that create entirely blue delegations from New England. It pushes out an entire strain that could be a valuable moderating force. If you adopted something like the Fair Representation Act, Massachusetts would have 3 districts, each represented by 3 members. In those larger districts, just over 25% of the primary vote would be enough to be nominated, creating a diverse pool of nominees. That same share of the far bigger November electorate is now enough to win a seat. It's basically 1 seat for the left, for the right, for the center of every district, and truly competitive districts everywhere. Re-incentivizing our politicians, reorienting them toward a wider swath of voters would be the most meaningful and profound change we could make to address the root cause of our worsening dysfunction and polarization. It's our winner-take-all districts, largely uncompetitive due to gerrymandering or geography, that encourage members to pay attention to their base, to try to stave off any primary challenge, then coast into office in a November landslide. The average member of Congress wins in November by more than 30 percentage points. even though Congress as an institution remains deeply unpopular with the American people. It's not always because voters dislike the institution, but like their own member. It's because giant swaths of the district have no real choice at all and are unwilling to turn the levers of power over to the increasingly feared opposition party. Do you imagine larger districts, a fairer system empowering more voters to nominate and elect who they want, where that strategy is no longer enough? The electoral incentives shift. Rather than running scared from their own base, rather than voting to not certify an election that we all know was free and fair, leaders can govern knowing that they are collectively accountable to a broader electorate. It is not too late to lower the partisan fever in policymaking, to ensure everyone feels represented, and to create incentives for Congress to address the will of the people. Getting there, however, will require unraveling the central problem that plagues the House: single-member winner-takes-all districts, one where 51% of the vote equals 100% of representation and 49% wins nothing. I think we can have a fairer democracy. We've simply got a lot of work to do over the next 10 years in order to get there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Always appreciate your opinions. If Mark is on here someplace, if he's on here that we haven't been able to find him, if he could raise his hand so we can let him in as a panelist, that would be helpful. Dr. Kyle Evans could not be with us tonight, which is unfortunate. He's fabulous if you've ever heard him. He did send some comments, which I will share. By way of introduction, Dr. Kyle Evans is visiting assistant professor of mathematics at Trinity College in Hartford. He created a mathematics and redistricting course at Trinity, which he teaches often and is very well received. Per Dr. Evans, the main uses of math in redistricting include, and make sense, quantifying partisan advantage, identifying potential racial gerrymandering, calculating compactness, and population deviation. These are all important factors in fair maps, and you'll see them talked about in different places. And with math, you can actually kind of see it. He makes it come alive. I'm not able to do that. Regarding calls to action for the public, Dr. Evans suggests understand the process and priorities in your area, whether it's town borders, incumbent protection, or whatever. Get to know what's going on in your area. Secondly, practice making maps. There's this really cool app called Dave's Redistricting Map that we've all played with a little bit. And it just shows you the intricacy. There's nothing, you can't change one thing without changing everything else. And so it lends itself, and it's learning by doing. And then identify areas of concerns of improvements, compactness in town borders, competitiveness, incumbent protection, what they are, and kind of get to know them. So he does a much better job at this and has a lot of information. If you would like, you can email him at kyle.evans@trincol, TRINCOLL.edu. So that is Kyle's. Do we have Mark on here? Did Mark? I don't see him.
Bryce, it's Claudia. Nobody raised their hand to say that they were Mark. Let's just give them another chance. If Mark, if you're in here and not labeled, just hit the raise your hand button. Okay.
All right, so if we have Representative Himes, David Daly, and Joan Twiggs on, we can start our panel discussion. And I'm just going to throw out a question or two. There's no style to this. There's no order. If you have something to comment about or discuss, you're very welcome to. I've got a bunch of questions. We'll take as much time as we need or not when we get to the end, and we'll go from there. All right. So you can unmute yourselves and we'll go. The first question, I think, is, redistricting as a topic lacks pizzazz. There's really no sex appeal with it. And with 10 years in between map drawings, it fades into the background. What more can journalists, school curriculums, advocates do to shine a light on its crucial importance in our democracy?
Let me say a few words about that, Bryce. I think it's a really good question. It's an important question. And it is certainly true that, we can't finish one redistricting cycle and then wait another, 8 or 9 years to get geared up again. And so that is the question. How do we keep the spotlight on redistricting? And that is one of the reasons why I think the bill to create a study would be helpful. I think it would be very, very helpful to have broader panels, such as the series you've created, but statewide, that put a spotlight on some of the other methods that other states have used. Bring New Mexico in to talk about the Citizens Commission, have the independent, have some representation from the independent commissions. Congressman Himes pointed out that most of the states that have moved in this direction have done so through citizen referenda. Well, we don't have that option here in Connecticut. So how do we move it forward? And that the fact that there was no, while the league was speaking as loud as we could, there was no really incentive to really to respond in an action-oriented way to some of our calls. And so how do we build up that pressure? And I think that having a review, a study, and corresponding publicity and education about that would help us to enhance that spotlight.
Anyone else?
Well, as someone who's written a book with a very sexy title, I would say gerrymandering is a super sexy topic, and what we have to do, what I think we have to do, and what I think journalists have to do, and nobody was talking about this when I wrote this 5 years ago, and things have changed around this topic over that time, because people have come to understand how crucial and important these lines are, and how when these district lines get warped, it undermines the very essence of democracy itself. In 2012, when Barack Obama is reelected president and Democrats expand the number of seats they hold in the US Senate, the Democrats got 1.4 million more votes for the US House that year. Republicans won 234 seats and held a 33-seat majority, regardless of the will of the people. After the 2018 elections, there were 59 million Americans. This is an outrageous number. 59 million Americans lived in a state in which one or both chambers of the state legislature was controlled by the party that won fewer votes in that fall's election. This is about how those lines are drawn, and they're drawn more surgically than ever. The lines that were drawn in 2011 survived for an entire decade in Wisconsin, North Carolina, Texas, Florida, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania. Those chambers did not budge even when the opposing party won hundreds of thousands of more votes. So we are in a really dangerous moment for our democracy. And I think the news media is beginning to talk about it a little bit more in this regard, but needs to talk about it more in that way. The threat to democracy itself, the threat on public policy that gets pushed far to the extreme, whether it's on reproductive rights in state legislatures that are going farther than the people would have them go, even in red states like Alabama. And then I think that there's a connection. The congressman earlier was talking about the concentric circles of his concern, with at the middle being election negation by state legislatures. And in many ways, that begins with partisan gerrymandering, electing the kind of extreme lawmakers who then go to state capitals and vote on these bills in order to give themselves greater power over local election boards or take away the power of elected secretaries of state. I don't think it's any accident or coincidence that this is happening in places like Arizona and Georgia and Wisconsin, states that taken together 44,000 votes, kept the Electoral College from being a tie, essentially, in 2020, even though Joe Biden won the popular vote by a little over 7 million. So we have to talk about gerrymandering as the real threat that it is on every level.
Bryce, I would quickly add, I think David, excellent treatment and excellent sense of urgency about it. I'd add just a couple of quick notes. Very interesting to me that the country has reached historic levels of disapproval for the parties. I was sort of musing around the question the other day about whether the U.S. could ever cough up a third party. Kind of interesting question. The answer, because of first past the post voting is almost certainly no, at least now. But the facts are really remarkable. I mean, I don't think in the last 2 generations we've seen as many Americans disillusioned with the 2 parties, and that's a function of this, right? Of the abandonment of the reasonable center. So I do think that the field is becoming increasingly amenable to reforms like this one. As somewhat of a practitioner of how you sell things to people, the Congress is offering up some real examples, and I'm not going to name names. You know who they are, and they live on both sides, although I will not tolerate the suggestion that it is a symmetrical problem right now. But there are examples that can be held up as people who really need to be held accountable by some reasonable instinct. And so I think it's possible. And then last note, yeah, it's technical and esoteric, but the state of Maine, for Pete's sake, instituted ranked choice voting. I don't actually know how that happened, but the fact that the state of Maine instituted ranked choice voting, which actually made all the difference in the election of one member of the House of Representatives, gives me hope that technical stuff in the face of disillusionment can make progress.
Well, one of the things, and this goes into the next question, but one of the things is that we seem to get outraged after the horses left the barn. We don't understand it until we're appalled by examples of redistricting and gerrymandering and whatever. And so that's why we want to make sure that we keep educating and trying to get in front of this. So this leads me to my other question. Representative Himes, I'll start with you. How can individuals say just in Connecticut or a less wild state, whatever the word is, how can we protest partisan maps in other states because it makes a difference. So, it makes a difference in how federal funds are determined, who's got the majority in the House. I mean, it affects us all, but it can be difficult to see how you're going to impact what's going on in Texas if you're living in Connecticut. So can you help us out there?
Yeah, it's the perennial question. I've spent a lot of time with my partisan hat on answering precisely that question. Lots of Democrats interested how, though they live in a blue state, they can help in states like Ohio, et cetera, swing states. It's an analogous question. I think the obvious answer here with the League of Women Voters is that there's remarkable national organizations, good government organizations that are working really hard around this stuff. And the League is the oldest and the premier one. But there's at least a dozen organizations that are working on good government, that are promoting everything from ranked choice voting to the electoral college compact. This idea that if enough states sign on to the idea of giving their electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote, eventually what I consider sort of the absurdity of the electoral college is overridden. So others will know many of them, but there's at least a dozen spectacular organizations working nationally that are worthy of support, and that I think can show some real successes around the country. Oh, and by the way, if I might, very quickly, let me name this problem. I hear every day, and we all need to do a better job in addressing this problem. I hear every single day the diagnosis that the problem is that people like me won't put the national interest ahead of our partisan interest. I hear it all the time. Why won't they just do what's right for America? Now, there's a lot of problems with that construction, obviously, because all of us have different versions of what's right with America. But the fundamental misunderstanding is that this is fundamentally an individual problem. That I'm making a decision to so-called, support my party interest rather than the national interest. The good thing about a representative government is that it is representative, and that people like me generally respond to the structural incentives that exist. When we don't do that, it's held up as enough of an interesting thing that John F. Kennedy wrote a book about it, Profiles in Courage, right? And by the way, I'm not sure that constant profiles in courage is exactly what our founders would have wanted in a representative government. But my point is, we need to get people off of this trope, this damaging trope, that the fundamental problem is the individuals. They may be problematic for other reasons, but the fundamental problem is an issue of structural incentives.
Yeah, and just to say in regards to that, and also fitting it in with a call to action for people on the meeting who have not looked at the Our Common Purpose report done by the commission, by the American Academy of, I can't think of it right now, but it's Our Common Purpose, and it does exactly that. It talks about the structural nature of these problems and the structural responses that are necessary. David talked a lot about one of their recommendations, which was the creation of multi-member seats. And I think you extended that a bit, David, to talk about the at-large seats for states such as ours. That sort of is a structural response to the particular dysfunction that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think if I could extend the call to action, I think we can learn a lot from the states that have managed to fix and reform these processes. I think we can look to a state like Michigan, where a 27-year-old woman named Katie Fahey, 2 days after the 2016 election, a little bit depressed, she'll admit, but she was also thinking about Thanksgiving at her house with Trump voters and Hillary voters and angry Bernie bros, and imagining mashed potatoes and cranberry sauce flying through the air, at a Grand Rapids Thanksgiving. And she took to Facebook and she put up a post and said, I want to do something about gerrymandering in Michigan. If you want to help me, let's do something. And that Facebook post led to a redistricting revolution in Michigan. Tens of thousands of volunteers collecting 430,000 signatures, getting on the ballot and winning in Michigan with 61% of the vote in 2018. You've got an independent commission that drew congressional and state legislative lines in a state that was one of the most gerrymandered in the nation over the course of the last decade. You can attribute the Flint water crisis, all kinds of things, to the way that those maps had been drawn a decade ago as far as policy outcomes. And they managed citizens together across party lines, right? 61%. That's not Democrats, that's not just independents, that's a real a coalition of people working across party lines. And it's similar coalitions that, won ranked choice voting in Maine, as the congressman mentioned, that expanded Medicaid in Idaho, that won a felony reenfranchisement in Florida with 64% of the vote in 2018, that together in Virginia in 2020 became the only state that has turned over some control over redistricting without a ballot initiative, because citizens there between 2016 and 2020 made such a ruckus that they forced the state effectively. They showed up and proved that it mattered to them, and they got that amendment through the state legislature, not only once in 2019 under Republican control, but again in 2020 under Democratic control. So it can be done. And there's a lot that we can learn from looking at successes around the country.
Thank you. And Mark, I see you've joined us.
Yes, my apologies. I actually just joined you in order to ask how you introduced the title of Dave Daly's book.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
I said I really tuned in to see if you gave the full title of Dave Daly's excellent book on gerrymandering.
I have a different way of saying it.
Ah,
Mark, this is the League of Women Voters. They don't
I
use that
understand.
word.
That's what killed me to be late, but I'm sorry. I had a somewhat complicated and sensitive story that I'm still working on, but
Okay, well, I'm glad that you're here.
I'm trying to avoid being sued.
Oh, well, that's important. I think we've got time for two more questions, and I want to just take it off a step back a little bit. The census is very important and obviously has a lot to do with redistricting. Do you think people have an understanding of the importance of the census? And looking forward to 2030, what reforms are needed to protect census integrity?
Well, I'd like to sort of take a little different tack at that. Regarding the reapportionment, you, meaning anybody who's interested in this, needs to be prepared way in advance. By the time the legislature begins to work on it and the reapportionment commission, it's really very late, particularly with regard to congressional redistricting. There's really no venue for public input in Connecticut. Now, the good news is, of course, it is bipartisan. It does, you don't have the same chicanery that Dave Daly has described in his book in Pennsylvania. But we are stuck with this pretty ugly map, a result of going from 6 seats to 5 seats 20 years ago. And, some of Congressman Himes' colleagues, I won't mention names, Jim, they've raised objections to really any significant modifications. So yes, the census is important. This was an odd cycle in that COVID delayed the census. It delayed the arrival of the data that the legislature needs to take on the task. But again, when it comes to the congressional map, it always takes a back seat to the General Assembly districts because it's the General Assembly that makes the maps. And so they are concerned about their own elections. And at the end, and this is what happened 10 years ago, you have, kind of a cursory effort to revise the maps. They couldn't do it. So it goes to the Connecticut Supreme Court, which has made very clear they are not interested in the map making business, that they will order a special master as they did this time and 10 years ago to make the minimal changes. So for people who want to see districts that make more sense geographically, that are more compact, that don't put New Britain on the edge of Hartford in the same district as Danbury on the edge of New York in the same district, just because it made sense 20 years ago when you had 2 incumbents ending up in the same district, it's going to take a lot of work in advance of when the process itself starts. And, it's a window that opens and closes very quickly. It's the political version of Brigadoon. It's there and it's not, and it doesn't come back for 10 years.
Does anybody else want to address the census question? Nope. Okay, then we are going to end with, do you feel optimistic or pessimistic that gerrymandering will end in the next decade? And why?
Let me go first because I'm probably the deep pessimist here. So I will allow other people to try to cheer you all up before this ends, so you don't all want to go off and have a cup of hemlock at the end of this evening. I think that we're in the middle of a redistricting partisan bloodbath this cycle that could be as bad as the last cycle, certainly, perhaps even worse, the number of competitive seats around the country shrinking rapidly, congressional map that has just been frozen in place, and state legislative maps around the country, which we don't talk about as much, but in many ways just as locked in, even in our most competitive states, even in states that are changing quickly, Texas, Georgia, Arizona. You're going to see maps drawn that are going to potentially, as demographic change has come to those states, they've caught up with the maps that were drawn 10 years ago. And now the finish line of a real multiracial democracy in these states has been pushed an additional 10 years down the line. And I think that is extraordinarily dangerous. You've got a court system that in 2019, the US Supreme Court effectively closed the doors of the federal courts to partisan gerrymandering claims. They said it's a non-justiciable political question. They did this just at the time that lower federal courts agreed not only on the importance of doing this, but recognized that they had clear and manageable standards. Some of that due to the tremendous work that mathematicians, like our own folks at Trinity, are doing. I have a very whiny dog here, so I will wrap up quickly. But the combination of the courts and the politics of this, the fact that 5 seats separate the two parties, means that each district more important than ever, but because lawmakers effectively have been given a free hand by this court in order to draw whatever districts they want, they have got a green light and no speed limit.
Bryce, I'd take a slightly more optimistic tone in as much as it's sort of hard to look at the progress that has been made around this in the last, let's call it 15 years and not see some progress there. I don't have at hand how many states have elected to, usually through some form of referendum, to put in place nonpartisan commissions, but the vector is moving in the right direction, as is the question of ranked choice voting. I hear about that a lot more than I used to. 10 years ago, it probably never came up. Now, so it's when you say, is it going to be done in the next 10 years? I can't say I'm optimistic about that, but I do think that the direction is a good one. And you also can't help but notice that a lot of the states that have implemented commissions have been those swing states. Why is that? Because you sort of can arrive at a detente between the Republican and Democratic apparatus. I'll offer one Hail Mary, and I'm not going to say that I would bet my next paycheck on this, but the Hail Mary in this regard is I'm very intrigued by the fact that there's a bipartisan group in the Senate, I think it's a dozen or so senators, who are working on an overhaul of the Electoral Count Act of 1887. Very technical, but very important, back to January 6th, right? It would clarify that all of the nonsense that was attempted on January 6th or leading up into January 6th that still gets debated about whether Mike Pence did the right thing, et cetera, et cetera. It would just clarify a lot of the procedures that are otherwise subject to some ambiguity. That, by the way, is the sort of apocalyptic scenario because, had Mike Pence gone in a different direction, the chaos that would have ensued before the courts might have stepped in, before popular mobilization, et cetera, you can sort of, whatever you think the outcome is, that is a very, very dangerous moment of chaos that worries me, by the way, far more than the pace at which we're sort of trying to create more fair districts. But anyway, the Hail Mary is that that the Electoral Count Act reform does get passed. And then, of course, the magic will be to hang on to that Electoral Count Act, things that both parties would allow through the Congress. I wouldn't rule out that perhaps a requirement for national commissions might be included. And I say that for one reason, not because all of a sudden, civic virtue is going to rise as a massive value in the United States Congress, but because if you look at the way this gerrymandering was done from a partisan standpoint, David's absolutely right. We have never seen quite so many safe districts, but from a partisan standpoint, the story is interesting. because Republicans controlled 2/3 of the state legislatures, the expected outcome was that the Democrats were going to get crushed in the redistricting. That has not happened. And in fact, the likely outcome, depending on the resolution of some court cases, is it'll be either a draw or, remarkably, because of the crazy activities in places like New York and Maryland, that remarkably the Democrats might even come out a seat or two ahead. I'm not celebrating or condemning that. I'm just saying that because of the expectation swing in that process, I wouldn't rule out, and I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I wouldn't rule out that if an Electoral Count Act does move forward, that you might be able to hang that onto it.
And I would just say, I take a much more Zen approach to the entire thing. I say the question is not really how you feel, it's what you do. And so in keeping with the theme of call to action, then I really recommend that people do stay engaged, people do take action, write to the co-chairs of the GAA committee and support a redistricting study task force, and check out the Our Common Purpose report.
Thank you. That kind of concludes our portion, and I really appreciate all your input. It's a fabulous panel, very interested and interesting people. You're experts at this, and we appreciate your time and sharing it with us. So we're going to do a couple things after, but your portion is done, and it could be Miller time or whatever. So thank you for joining us, and we'll talk to you. We'll hope to see you soon.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Bryce.
All right. So now we'd like to conclude our program with a few words from our wonderful partners. We couldn't have done this series without them. I mean, it's phenomenal. And we've had such support, and I have to tell you, the level of support and cooperation and expertise and professionalism has just been astounding. So Heather Maxson is the Deputy Director for Programs at Fairfield Museum and History Center, which hosted our October 14th inaugural event. And Heather, I'll turn it over to you now to say a few words. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Bryce. Thank you for the introduction. Like Bryce said, I'm the Deputy Director for Programs at the Fairfield Museum, and we were excited to host the first of this series with Joan and David. And we've been delighted to work with the Fairfield League of Women Voters, who are longtime partners, wonderful community partners of the museum on this meaningful event series. I wanted to just say thank you to Bryce and Sandra and Linda and many others who put in tireless volunteer hours to bring this work forward. So I just wanted to thank you and for educating me so much about the redistricting process. At the Fairfield Museum, we believe in the power of the arts and humanities to inspire imagination, stimulate thought, and transform society. Through dynamic programs and exhibitions, the Fairfield Museum sparks dialogue, inspires meaningful collaborations, and deliberates the challenges of the future. Central to our community-focused mission is the desire to provide important historical context to pressing issues of our time, and to offer a safe and trustworthy environment where multiple perspectives can be heard and collective solutions explored. We believe that by bringing people together and creating opportunities for them to share their experiences and perspectives, we can create a more empathetic and equitable community. And this is why it's so important for us to partner with groups like the Fairfield League of Women Voters, because it's critical to a healthy democracy to have an informed and active citizenry, and to believe that we can catalyze social change. We have a number of upcoming programs for schools and families, and I'll just highlight a couple. On President's Day, on next Monday, we have a workshop for families where we're looking at presidential portraits and then creating our own. So if you know anyone who would be interested, let me know. We have a History Bites lunchtime lecture with Merle Sprins and Tessier on the history of Little Wonder Records on February 23rd. And then we have a free open house just for teachers on March 3rd at 4 o'clock. And our website has more information. But that's all from me. But I just wanted to thank the League for all your wonderful work educating our community, and for including the Fairfield Museum in the programming.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you so much. It's our pleasure, truly. Claudia Silk is the Adult Services Librarian at Fairfield Public Library. The library was host of the December 7th and tonight's sessions. So thank you, Claudia, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. We feel as a group that the League of Women Voters and the Fairfield Public Library are natural partners for many reasons. The most obvious is that both our organizations take pride in offering unbiased, balanced information to the public. We both access the most accurate and authoritative speakers. Both organizations equip the public with the knowledge they need to make informed decisions for themselves. We don't tell people how or what to think. We offer a wide variety of information so the public can make decisions for themselves. We believe knowledge equals power, and we believe that that's why this is such a great relationship. And I loved working with all of you. It was really it's fun.
Thank you. Thank you.
And enlightening.
Fairfield University was our host and presenters for our November 18th session. Fairfield U has also hosted the League's legislative forums and continues to be a strategic partner of the League of Women Voters. And I just want to say one more time, these partnerships have changed the way that the League can share information and reach the public, and partnerships like these are just, beyond words. So thank you again. I want to say that the recordings of all the sessions of Spotlight on Redistricting and Your Vote can be seen on Fair TV on demand and on the League of Women Voters Connecticut website, which is my.lwv.org/Connecticut, all spelled out. And then look for our next series, Spotlight on Voting Rights, that's coming soon, and we'll be working with our partners again. So thanks again to all our panelists, our partners, and Representative Jim Himes. I hope to see you all soon. And with that, I bid you good night.